The carriage arrived before the house was properly awake. It came down the lane at 5:30 in the morning of the 3rd of November. The lanterns still burning at the gateposts of Ashmore Park. The sky the color of pewter, bruised with the first suggestion of light. The coachman sat very straight. The horses were matched bays, their breath hanging in small clouds above the frozen mud of the lane. The Kessler crest was on the door, that spare device of a hawk and a chevron. And it was unmistakable to anyone who knew the county. Miss Cecily Briar knew it. She had been standing at her window since 4 o'clock, her candle long reduced to a pool of tallow, her cloak already wrapped about her, and her single portmanteau already buckled shut, because she had not slept at all. She had thought he would not send it. She had told herself for 2 days and 2 nights that the man did not mean what his letter said, that some correction would arrive, that she had misread the plain words, that the world did not work in the way the letter implied. The letter was 9 lines long. She had read it perhaps 40 times. She watched the coachman climb down and speak to the under-footman who had emerged from the side door in his shirt-sleeves, still blinking, his breath also making small clouds in the cold. She could not hear what was said. She watched the under-footman go inside at a run, and she pressed her fingers against the cold glass of the window and tried to steady the thing inside her chest that was not quite hope, because she had made a long practice of not naming it. Downstairs in the wide entry hall of Ashmore Park, something was already beginning to happen. She could hear it through the floorboards. She had spent 14 months in that house. She had come to Ashmore Park in the autumn after her father's death had dissolved his living and left her with £32, a letter of character from the Bishop of Ely, and a working knowledge of French, Italian, watercolor, and pianoforte. She had been engaged to instruct the 3 daughters of Sir Gerald Ashmore in those accomplishments, and she had done so with the particular thoroughness of a woman who could not afford to do otherwise. The daughters were 7, 9, and 13. They were not cruel children. They were simply the daughters of a house in which the weather was set by their mother, and Lady Ashmore set a very particular weather. Cecily had understood the situation inside the first fortnight. Lady Ashmore was a handsome woman of 42, who had spent her girlhood as the second daughter of a baron and had married down in rank while ascending in income, and she had never entirely resolved that arithmetic to her satisfaction. She received with great warmth the wives of titled men. She was gracious to women of her own station. She was perfectly civil to her cook and her senior housemaids, whom she regarded as the natural furniture of her life. It was the middle space that she did not know how to navigate, the space where a woman of birth and education found herself in reduced circumstances, and Cecily occupied that space, precisely. A governess, Lady Ashmore had said at the dinner table in early October. To Lady Pemberton and Mrs. Clifford and 2 other women whose names Cecily had not yet learned. In the drawing room where Cecily happened to be passing with a pile of the girls' compositions, the word was not unkind. It was merely exact, the way a taxonomist names a specimen. Cecily had not paused. She had continued walking with her pile of papers, and heard behind her the slight modulation of tone that serves as punctuation, the brief silence that a category-settling remark produces in a room of women who share the category. She had heard similar phrasings perhaps a dozen times since that evening, in a dozen variations, a governess and nothing more. Merely a governess. Well, she is only the governess. Each iteration landed with the same taxonomic precision. Each was voiced by a named member of the household social circle, never by Lady Ashmore herself, who was too practiced for directness, and never in a register that permitted protest. The most recent had been Mrs. Clifford. At the end of October, saying it to Lady Pemberton in the corridor outside the drawing-room when Cecily was walking the passage above, the words drifting upward with their particular clarity. A governess, you know, whatever her background. She had simply continued. There was no other way that would not have cost her the position. She had continued through the winter and into the spring, teaching the eldest girl her scales and the middle one her irregular French verbs and the youngest one to hold a brush correctly. She had walked to church on Sundays 2 paces behind the family. She had eaten in the schoolroom. She had managed the quarterly accounts for the school supplies without being asked and saved Lady Ashmore £11 in the process without mentioning it. She had written to her father's old friend Reverend Hatch on the youngest girl's behalf when the child developed a fever and the household physician was delayed because she had some knowledge of fevers from her years in the parsonage, and the child had recovered. She had done all of this quietly, because there was no other way to do it that would not have cost her the position. It was in April that she had first seen the Baron of Kessler. He had come to Ashmore Park for a dinner that she was not included in, which was correct and proper and as expected, and she had been in the schoolroom with the children when she heard the quality of silence that precedes the arrival of someone the household regards as significant. She had looked out of the schoolroom window and seen a man dismounting in the courtyard below. He was perhaps 35, she thought. He was not a large man, but he moved with the economy of someone who had learned not to waste motion, and he gave his horse to the groom without looking at the animal, which told her the handoff was habitual, which told her the horse was very well managed, which told her something about how he conducted his arrangements generally. He had dark hair and a face that was at the distance of a second-floor window, sharp at the jaw and quiet at the expression. He wore a dark coat. He did not look up. She had not thought of him again for 6 weeks. It was June when she had occasion to think of him. One of the horses in the stable had taken lame, and Sir Gerald had sent the junior grooms away on other errands, and Cecily had been walking the youngest girl, Fanny, in the kitchen garden when the child had run ahead and turned her ankle on the uneven path near the wall. It was not severe. She was quite sure of that almost immediately. But Fanny had been frightened. The kitchen garden was at some distance from the house, and Cecily had gathered the child and was considering her options when she heard a horse. A man was riding along the lane that bordered the kitchen garden wall, and he had pulled up almost immediately. "Is the child injured?" he said. His voice was low and level, the kind that does not rise to reach you but expects you to attend to it. "She has turned her ankle," Cecily said. "I do not believe it is serious. She will be well in a moment. Can she walk?" It was not quite a question. She looked up properly then, and found that it was the Baron of Kessler, and that he was looking at Fanny with an expression she could not immediately classify. Something very level, and also very carefully, not alarmed, which she recognized several seconds later as the specific expression of a man who knew how to look at a frightened child without adding to the child's fright. "I think so," she said, "in a moment." He dismounted without further discussion and tied his horse to the gatepost and came through the garden gate, and he crouched down in front of Fanny at a distance that was close enough to be useful and far enough to be unthreatening. And he said, "Which foot?" "Ma." Fanny looked at him and then at Cecily, and Cecily gave the small nod, and Fanny said, "This one," and he looked at the foot without touching it and said, "It is not broken. You may stand on it if you choose to." And Fanny, who had been weeping, stopped weeping and stood. He rose. He looked at Cecily for a moment with an expression she still could not read. "You managed it correctly," he said. The child was frightened, not hurt. He went back through the gate and untied his horse and rode on without another word. Cecily stood in the kitchen garden with Fanny's hand in hers and felt for a reason she chose not to examine that something had happened that she had not expected. He came to Ashmore Park 2 more times before September. She did not see him on the first occasion, which was a hunting party. On the second occasion, in August, he came alone in the afternoon and was admitted to Sir Gerald's study, and Cecily was in the small sitting room adjacent to it, with the girls when she heard, through the wall, a conversation of which she could distinguish only the tone and not the words. Sir Gerald's tone was the tone he used when a matter of business was more consequential than he had anticipated. The Baron's tone was a level thing that gave very little away. She did not listen. She directed the girls' attention to their embroidery, and her own attention to the window and the garden, where the late summer roses were doing their last work before the frost. It was not until the 3rd week of October that Lady Ashmore said anything directly to her. And she had called Cecily into the morning room, which was something Lady Ashmore did rarely, preferring to conduct household matters at a distance through Mrs. Whitlock, the housekeeper. She had been seated at her writing desk, and she did not look up immediately, which was a particular form of address that Cecily had long since learned to receive without expression. "Lord Kessler has made inquiries," Lady Ashmore said. Cecily said nothing. "He has asked Sir Gerald whether you are suited to a change of situation. He requires a governess for his wards, his late wife's niece and nephew, 2 children, 8 and 11. They have been without a governess for some months." She said it in the same tone one might use to announce that the cellar had suffered an infestation. She paused, in the way she always paused, before the phrase that carried the weight. "It is, of course, still a governess's position." Cecily understood the sentence perfectly. "Do not mistake this for an elevation. Whatever quality of attention the Baron of Kessler has chosen to direct at you, it does not change the category in which you exist." "Yes," Cecily said, "of course." Lady Ashmore looked at her for the first time. There was something in her expression that Cecily had not seen there before, something that might have been curiosity, or might have been a species of warning. "He lost his wife 3 years ago," she said. "He does not speak of it." "I've heard nothing that would suggest any impropriety on his part," Cecily said carefully. "No," Lady Ashmore said, and her tone shifted fractionally, became less instructional and more genuinely uncertain. "No, one would not say that of him." Cecily had been given 3 days to consider, and she had spent those 3 days doing what she had always done with difficult considerations, which was to look at them directly, without the interference of what she wished they were. She had looked at the facts. The position was a governess's position. The household was unknown to her. The Baron was a widower, with wards who were not his own children, which suggested something about him that she was not yet entitled to name. He had asked about her suitability, which meant he had noticed her to some degree, which meant something she could not quantify. She was 24 years old, and she had £32 and a letter of character. She had written to accept on the 2nd day. The letter had arrived from Kessler Hall the following morning, 9 lines, as she had counted. The carriage would be sent on the 3rd of November at 5:30 in the morning. If that hour suited her, 9 lines, and then his name, written in a hand that was spare and clear, with no ornament whatsoever. If that hour suited her. She had stood in the schoolroom holding the letter and feeling something turn over very quietly in her chest. And she had not named it, but she had not put the letter down for quite some time. Now she heard the voices from downstairs growing distinct, and she recognized Lady Ashmore's voice carrying its customary measured quality. At a rather earlier hour than was customary, she gathered her cloak more closely and picked up her portmanteau and opened the door. The corridor was empty. She walked along it to the stairs. Below her, in the entry hall, Lady Ashmore stood in her dressing gown and her lace cap, with Sir Gerald beside her in his coat thrown over his nightshirt, both of them conferring with the under-footman. All 3 of them turned toward the front door, through which the Kessler coachman's crest was visible on the carriage. Lady Ashmore's back was very straight. She did not turn when Cecily came down the stairs, but she spoke. "He has sent a footman as well," she said, not to Cecily specifically, but to the entry hall generally, "and an outrider." Cecily reached the bottom of the stairs. The footman in Kessler livery standing at the door turned and moved to take the portmanteau from her hand. She released it. "He might have sent word of the hour," Lady Ashmore said. She turned then and looked at Cecily, and there was something in her face that was neither gracious nor unkind. That was simply the face of a woman who had understood something she had not understood before, and did not yet know what to do with the understanding. "A governess!" she said. It was the same word she had used in October, the same taxonomic precision. This time she said it looking at the Kessler carriage outside the door, and the Kessler outrider in the lane, and the Kessler footman standing at Cecily's shoulder with the portmanteau, and the word landed differently than it had before. Cecily did not require her to say anything further. I am grateful for the position, Cecily said. The girls are a pleasure to teach. Lady Ashmore looked at her. You will give my regards to Lord Kessler, she said. Of course, Cecily said. She stepped out into the cold morning. Kessler Hall was 22 miles northeast of Ashmore Park, and they arrived at 11 in the morning. The frost having softened somewhat, and the sky having gone from pewter to a pale and watery blue. The house was stone, Georgian in its lines, neither grand nor modest, set back from its gates by a long avenue of beeches that had lost the last of their leaves, and stood in their true architecture, the bare branches crossing over the lane like a vaulted ceiling. A woman of perhaps 50, severe, in black wool, was standing at the top of the stone steps as the carriage drew up. She introduced herself as Mrs. Brax. Gala, the housekeeper, without warmth and without coldness, simply with the precision of a woman who managed a considerable household and did not waste time on inessentials. She showed Cecily through a hallway that was clean and high-ceilinged, and hung with a few good portraits of people she did not recognize, and told her that his lordship would receive her at 2, and that luncheon would be served in the dining-room, and that the children would be brought to her at 3. At 2 o'clock she was shown to the study. Books on 3 walls. A fire that had been burning long enough to make the room genuinely warm, rather than performatively so. First, a wide desk with papers that had the look of papers regularly worked with. 2 windows facing north, the light clear and not flattering. She liked the room immediately, which surprised her. He was standing at the window. He turned when she entered, and she had the sensation she sometimes had in the schoolroom of time behaving oddly, of a moment being longer than its clock measurement. She had not seen him at close range with proper light since the kitchen garden in June, and she had apparently forgotten, in the interval, the particular quality of his attention, which was the kind that did not move between things but settled on what it was directed at. "Miss Briar," he said, "my lord." He looked at her for a moment with the expression she had been unable to classify since June. "I will not waste your time with pleasantries. You know the situation." "I know that your wards require instruction," she said, "and that you have been without a governess for some months." 4 months. Since July. He said it as though he had anticipated that she might wonder. Charlotte is 11. Thomas is 8. Charlotte is accomplished for her age and knows it, which presents its own challenge. Thomas has a stammer when he is anxious, which most adults manage badly. She noted that he had said most adults, not most people, which suggested he had observed the management across several persons, and formed a view. "I do not require ornamental instruction," he said. "I require that they learn what they need, to manage the world as it is. Charlotte will eventually be brought out. Thomas will need Latin and mathematics and some confidence in his own voice. I do not require them to be polished. I require them to be capable." She looked at him. "And if they are also polished in the course of becoming capable," she said, "you will not object." Something happened in his expression. Very slight. The specific thing that is not quite a smile but is adjacent to one. "No," he said, "I will not object." She had been at Kessler Hall 1 week before she began to understand the shape of the house. It was not what she had expected. She had expected the efficient cold of a widower's establishment, the children orbiting the edges of their guardian's life at a respectful distance. Kessler Hall was not that. Charlotte was, as he had said, accomplished and aware of it. She played the pianoforte with real precision, and a kind of arrogance about that precision that Cecily recognized as the arrogance of a child who had been praised without also being challenged. She corrected her governess's pronunciation of French words on the 3rd day of lessons, looking up from her exercise with an expression of calm superiority, and Cecily said without heat, "You are correct." And in the patois spoken in Paris in 1798, which is the dialect I was taught, it is also pronounced as I have demonstrated. Both are usages in good standing. We will learn both. Charlotte looked at her for a moment and said nothing, and the next day she was marginally less arrogant and marginally more curious, which Cecily counted as an opening. Thomas was another matter. He was 8 years old, and slight for it, with a face that was still the rounded face of a young child, but with eyes already doing the work of someone older, watching everything and displaying very little. He did not stammer at first, with her. She noticed that he was watching for her reaction, braced for it the way one braces for a cold that has been promised, and she chose deliberately to show no reaction at all, simply to continue through whatever sentence he was navigating without pause, or adjustment, or any of the careful compensations that well-meaning adults usually imposed. By the end of the first week, he was reading aloud to her from a history of the Peninsular Campaign that she had found in the library and brought to the schoolroom, and the stammer, when it appeared, was not a crisis. She found the library at 7 o'clock on the Wednesday of her second week. Having waited until she was reasonably confident of the household's patterns, he was there. He said, "Stay," before she could speak in the flat way that might have been rudeness from another man, and was from him simply the most economical conveyance of a thing he wanted to say. She went to the shelves on the south wall and began to read the spines. "The Addison volumes are on the second shelf from the top left side," he said, without looking up from his papers. "I expect that is what you are looking for." "I was looking for the Gibbon," she said. A pause. "Second shelf from the bottom. Right side." She found it. She took the first volume to the small chair near the fire and read for an hour and a half, and he worked at his desk. And at 8:30 he set down his pen and rubbed the back of his hand across his eyes, which was the first entirely unguarded gesture she had seen him make. "Charlotte corrected you today," he said. "She did. Charlotte has informed the household that her new governess is satisfactory," something in his voice that might have been dry amusement. "From Charlotte, that is a considerable commendation." "Thomas was reading aloud today," he said. It was not framed as a question, and it carried the particular care of someone carrying something they would prefer not to drop. "He has not read aloud since July," he said. "He will read aloud again tomorrow," she said. "And the day after. He has an aptitude, when he is not waiting for the stammer to arrive." A pause. "How did you manage that?" "I did not manage it," she said. "I simply waited for him to trust that I was not going to make a ceremony of the stammer, and then he forgot to produce one." The silence that followed that exchange was not empty. It was the kind of silence that is doing something, accumulating something she could not have named, and she read for another 30 minutes, and then excused herself and went upstairs, and the thought she was least interested in examining followed her up the stairs and sat with her while she prepared for bed. If there are things worth noting here, let them be noted quietly. Because this is a story that does not want for noise. You may already know what she does not yet permit herself to know. Stay a little longer. It was in the third week that she heard it again. Mrs. Harrow was a neighbor, the wife of a local magistrate, who came to call on the Monday afternoon with her 2 daughters and a habit of benevolent social surveillance that she exercised without apparent awareness of its nature. She was not unkind. She was simply the kind of woman who required everything to be categorized before she could be comfortable. And Cecily's presence in the drawing room, where Lord Kessler had placed her for the duration of the call, without explanation, apparently presented a categorization difficulty. "How interesting," Mrs. Harrow had said, having been told Cecily was the children's governess, looking at her in the way one looks at something found in an unexpected place. "How very interesting, a governess." Cecily had smiled and said nothing, and the conversation had moved on. But she had heard the words settle into the room, and she had seen the way Mrs. Harrow's elder daughter, who was perhaps 20, and very finely dressed, had looked at her once and then chosen not to look again. He had been present for the exchange, when the call was concluded, and Mrs. Harrow and her daughters had been seen out. He came back to the drawing room and said, "I should not have brought you in for that." "It was perfectly civil," she said. "It was not," he said. His jaw was set in the way it set when he had made a decision and was conducting the aftermath of it. "Mrs. Harrow is not unkind, but she is precise about gradations, and I should have anticipated it." "My lord," she said, "I have managed gradations of that sort for 14 months. You need not concern yourself." He turned. "I am aware of that," he said. "That does not mean I intend to require it." She sat with that sentence for a moment. It was a kind of sentence she was not accustomed to receiving, the kind that assumed her comfort mattered in the same way that consequential things matter. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once and went back to his study, and she sat in the drawing room, with the sound of the fire and the light going off the beeches in the afternoon, and felt the thing in her chest that she had been not naming for several months do something it had not quite done before. The wound was in the library, on the evening of the second week of December. She had gone in at 7 and found him already there, and they had been in their familiar configuration for perhaps 40 minutes when he set his pen down and did not pick it up again. "My wife died in November of 1814, he said. He said it to the papers, or to the window, or to the particular quality of silence that lives in a room late in the evening when a fire has been going for hours. She had been unwell since the previous spring. She had wanted me to send for her sister's children, Charlotte and Thomas, before the summer was out because she knew by then what the autumn would bring." A pause. "I did not send for them. I told her she would recover. I managed the autumn as though it were a problem of logistics." He stopped. "She died in November, and the children came in December, and I have not known since then whether I brought them here for her sake or for mine." Cecily did not move. She was very conscious of the candle at his elbow, and the fire and the stillness of the room. "You brought them here," she said. "That is not a small thing. It is the least possible thing," he said. "A man who does the least possible thing and names it sufficient is still the man who did it," she said, "and not the man who did not." He was quiet for a long moment. "She kept a portrait of her sister," he said. "On the writing table in her sitting room. I have not moved it." Another pause. "Charlotte looks at it sometimes when she thinks I do not notice." "I know," Cecily said. "She has spoken to me about her mother, that she was very kind, and that she smelled of lavender water, and that she could play the pianoforte better than Charlotte can yet, which Charlotte regards as a solvable problem." He looked at her for the first time in the conversation, with an expression that was very near to the surface of his face. Too near to be comfortable, she thought, for a man who had kept things at their correct depth for 3 years. "Yes," he said. "That sounds entirely like her." He picked up his pen. She opened her book. They remained in the library for another hour, and the silence between them was not the same silence it had been before, and she thought, when she went upstairs, that she was no longer sure she was managing the not naming with the same success she had previously achieved. The invitation came at the end of January. The Harrows gave a dinner at Harrow Grange, and Lord Kessler received an invitation, which was unremarkable, and a secondary note from Mrs. Harrow suggesting that Miss Briar might perhaps accompany him as a companion for the evening, which was considerably more unusual, and which Mrs. Gale brought to Cecily with an expression that managed to convey a complete account of the situation without any direct statement. "His lordship would like to know if you are willing," Mrs. Gale said. Cecily read the note. She read it twice. "Tell him I will attend if he considers it appropriate," she said. Mrs. Gale went away. 20 minutes later she returned and said that his lordship considered it entirely appropriate and that the carriage would be brought round at 7 on Friday. He said very little in the carriage. She had grown accustomed to his silences by then, understood them as a form of presence that did not require filling. She looked at the darkness outside the window, and he looked at it also. Or perhaps at his hands. She could not tell. "Mrs. Harrow will manage it tactfully," he said, as they turned in at the Harrow gates. "Yes," she said. "I think she will. If she does not," he said, "you have only to tell me." She looked at him in the carriage lamplight. "I am quite capable of managing Mrs. Harrow," she said. "I know you are," he said. "I am asking you not to be required to." She looked at him for a moment more. There was something in the plainness of the statement that went past her defenses before she had positioned them. The carriage drew up. Mrs. Harrow had managed it tactfully. She seated Cecily 3 places from Lord Kessler on his right-hand side, and introduced her to Mr. Hand Ashby, who was a solicitor of some years' standing and a reader, and to Miss Pendleton, who was a retired schoolmistress of 70 and the most interesting person in the room, and Cecily spent the dinner in a genuinely pleasant three-way conversation about the reform of charity schools and the proper instruction of village children in letters and dot arithmetic. She was aware, across the table, of Lord Kessler. She was aware of the precise quality of his attention, which did not move to her with the obvious frequency that would have constituted a statement, but moved there occasionally, and at those moments had the particular quality of attention that she had been misattributing for 8 months to something other than what it was. She had stopped misattributing it sometime in December and had not yet decided what to do with the correct attribution. After dinner, the gentleman joined the ladies in the drawing-room, and he came eventually to stand near her chair, not at it, with the same exact calibration he had been exercising for months. "How is the reform of charity schools?" he said. "Much in need of improvement," she said. "Miss Pendleton is formidable." "She is," he said. "She taught me, briefly, when I was 6, and she was not yet retired." He was looking at Miss Pendleton across the room, and there was genuine warmth in his expression, unguarded. "She frightened me considerably. I learned my letters to avoid further frightening." "That seems an efficient method," Cecily said. He looked at her, and the warmth that had been directed at Miss Pendleton did not entirely leave his expression when it transferred. "Cecily," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. "Why?" He said it quietly, as though he had been considering it for some time and had decided this was the moment. And it was not a question and not a statement. It was simply her name in his voice, in this particular room, and it landed somewhere in the center of her chest with a quiet completeness she had no defense prepared for. She looked at him. He looked back. Across the room the fire crackled and someone laughed and the conversation continued, and neither of them spoke for a moment. "I should have sent the carriage sooner," he said. "The carriage arrived exactly when it was meant to," she said. Something shifted in his expression. The furthest reach of restraint, the last careful discipline of a man who had been very careful for a very long time. "I want to say something to you," he said, his voice very low. "And I want to say it correctly." She waited. "You came to this house," he said, "and you did not manage the children. You saw them. Charlotte is learning to be challenged, which she needed, and Thomas is reading aloud without catastrophe, which I had stopped believing was possible. You have done this without requiring acknowledgement of any kind, which is your character, and not a virtue you perform." A pause. "I have been watching, and I have found that I am not able to continue watching without telling you that I see what you are, and that I have developed a regard for you that is not appropriate to a guardian's regard for the governess of his wards." She looked at him for a long moment. "What you see me doing," she said carefully, "is my position." "Yes," he said. "I am aware of that, and your regard would make my position very complicated." "I am aware of that as well," he said. "I am not speaking to you about your position." She sat with that for a moment. The fire crackled. The room moved around them, oblivious. "You are not a man who says things he does not mean," she said. "No," he said, "I am not." "Then I will tell you," she said, looking at the fire rather than at him because she was not entirely confident of her own composure, "that I have also developed a regard which I have been managing with some effort for several months." A pause. "How much effort?" he said. "A considerable amount," she said. She heard something that was not quite a breath and not quite a laugh, the smallest private sound of a man who had been holding a thing carefully for a very long time and had been given permission to set it down. "I will speak to you further," he said, "when we are not in Mrs. Harrow's drawing room." "That seems wise," she said. He moved away back into the room, with the same unhurried quality he brought to all his movements, and she sat looking at the fire, and felt the thing in her chest that she had been not naming for 8 months expand to its actual size. In the carriage home he said that he intended, if she was willing, to speak to her formally, that he understood the asymmetry of their situations and did not intend to exploit it, and that if she was not willing, he would manage the situation as a man of honor managed such situations without disruption to her position or her comfort. She told him she was willing. He did not reach for her hand. He was a man of careful distances. He sat somewhat closer than was strictly necessary for the width of the carriage seat, and she was very aware of that proximity, the warmth of his coat sleeve against her own, the specific quality of the silence between them. There was no longer two people sharing a room, but something much more particular. And they did not speak again until the Kessler Avenue was visible in the lamplight, and the beeches were overhead. "Thomas will be pleased," she said eventually. "Thomas will be insufferably self-satisfied," he said. "He has been watching us for some time. He is 8, she said. "He is very observant for 8, he said. She thought about Thomas with his steady, careful eyes watching the world for the information it withheld from him by refusing to be still. "Yes," she said. "He is." What happened in the weeks following was not a simple thing, and she would not have wanted it to be. He was a man who did not do things quickly, and she was a woman who did not do them carelessly, and the combination of these qualities meant that what built between them built the way things build in cold weather, slowly and with a specific kind of strength. He came to the schoolroom one afternoon in February, and stood at the door and watched Charlotte instruct Thomas in the correct way to hold a pen, which Charlotte was doing with considerable authority, and which Thomas was tolerating with the patience of a younger brother, who has calculated that patience will serve him better than protest. He stood there for several minutes before either child noticed him. Cecily noticed him and chose not to say anything. He watched her, and then he watched the children, and then he came into the room and sat at the back of it in the reading chair she had placed there, and he stayed for the remainder of the afternoon's lesson. Thomas read a passage from the Peninsular History without incident. Charlotte demonstrated a proposition of Euclid's with a confidence that Cecily noted with private satisfaction. He said nothing at the end, but when he went, he paused at the door and looked at Cecily directly, and the look was enough. In the library, in the evenings, the conversations deepened. She learned the shape of his thinking, which was rigorous and concrete and not without humor, a dry and measured humor that appeared rarely and was the more effective for it. He learned that she had strong opinions about Gibbon, and even stronger ones about certain theological positions in the Bishop of Ely's sermons. They argued about the enclosure question one evening at considerable length, and she demonstrated to her private amusement that his position had an internal inconsistency, not by telling him so, but by asking 3 questions that allowed him to arrive at the inconsistency himself. "You argued me out of my position on the enclosure question," he said eventually, apparently having been reviewing the evening's conversation in retrospect. "I demonstrated that your position had an internal inconsistency," she said. "Is there a difference?" "Considerable," she said. "I did not persuade you. I showed you something. You persuaded yourself." He looked at her with an expression she recognized by now as his version of being surprised. "I think," he said, that is how you manage most things." "I prefer to work with what is already there," she said. One evening he came to stand beside her chair, which he had not done before. He was close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him in the cool air of the room, and she looked up at him and found him looking down with an expression that was no longer behind the curtain, but on his face, directly. He reached down and took her hand, very carefully, as one handles something not yet fully trusted to one's own grasp. He held it with her fingers upward, and looked at it as though it were something he was learning. "You have been managing things," he said, "for a very long time. Difficult positions, difficult households, difficult people." "I have been doing my work," she said. "Yes," he said, "that is what I mean." He looked up at her. "I would like to offer you a position that does not require managing." She looked at him. "I am not proposing that nothing will ever be difficult," he said, and something in his voice was so careful, so specific to the person he was speaking to, that she felt it in the particular places one feels things meant for one alone. "I am proposing that when it is difficult, you will not be alone in it." Her hand was very steady in his, which surprised her. She had expected to be less steady than this, had expected some version of herself that required managing. What she found instead was something very quiet and very certain, the way a key feels when it has finally found the lock it belongs to. "Ask it properly," she said. He did. They were married in the parish church at Kessler in the first week of April, on a morning that had the quality of early spring in that county, pale and clean, and with a light that came sideways from the east and touched the stone of the church and the white of her dress and the dark of his coat, with the specific consideration that April light sometimes has, as though it has waited all winter to touch those particular things. Mrs. Gale stood near the door with a face that managed to be both undemonstrative and entirely satisfied. Miss Pendleton sat in the second pew and watched with the expression of a woman who has seen a great many things and recognized this one as belonging to the category that warranted witnessing. Charlotte stood beside Thomas in the front pew. Charlotte was wearing her best dress and holding Thomas's hand, which she would have denied strenuously if anyone had commented on it. Thomas was watching the proceedings with the steady attention he brought to things he had decided. Mattered he did not stammer when he spoke to them afterward. Mrs. Harrow had called on Cecily the week before, without ceremony, and said that she was very glad, in the direct and private way one speaks, when one is saying what one actually thinks rather than what the situation requires. Cicely had thanked her, and found somewhat to her surprise that she meant it. The letter from Ashmore Park arrived the afternoon before the wedding. It was from Lady Ashmore, 2 pages, written in the style of a woman who had rehearsed it several times. It was not an apology, exactly. It was something in the vicinity of an apology that had been constructed by a woman for whom apology was not an available grammatical form. It said that she had always valued Cecily's work with the girls. It said that she hoped Cecily would be content. It said that the middle daughter had made considerable progress in her French since Cecily's departure, which Cecily recognized as the specific way such a letter offers the compliment it cannot bring itself to offer directly. She read it twice and put it away, not unkindly. By the summer, the portrait of Lady Kessler's sister had been moved from the sitting room to the schoolroom, where Charlotte had asked for it, and Thomas had found that he did not stammer when he read aloud from the Peninsular History, or from the Gibbon, or from the letters he was beginning to write to a school friend whose mother had admired his hand. The library in the evenings was what it had been, with the difference that it was now a shared thing, in the way only shared things can be, differently weighted, differently warm. On a Tuesday evening in late June, while the garden was still light at 9 o'clock, and the windows were open to the sound of the beeches, Cecily sat in the chair by the fire with the Gibbon, and he sat at his desk with his papers, and neither of them spoke for a long time. And in the silence was everything that had been built slowly. Tea and cold, weather and warm, out of what had been there to begin with. She had not managed this. She had not waited for it. She had simply continued to be what she was in the rooms where she found herself, until the rooms had become her own. The candle at his elbow burned steadily. The beeches moved in the evening air. She turned the page, and the evening held them both, and it was enough, and it was home. Thank you for sitting with Cecily until the very end. If her story found its way to you, leave a thought below. These small, careful stories exist because of the people who stay.